According to archived documents, on maps from 1953, this forest was marked as the Abyss Zone. By 1955, all mention of it had disappeared. Since then, police stations have kept folders stamped with a single phrase, "Missing. Circumstances unknown." 70 years. More than 40 names. All of them walked into this forest. Not all of them walked out. Those who returned spoke of strange things, clocks that lied, time that ran backwards, and someone standing between the trees, watching. This story is not about them. This story is about two brothers who entered the forest in the summer of 1995. One of them never came back, and 30 years later he sent word. Not by mail. One morning, it simply appeared somewhere it could not possibly be. If you ever find yourself at the edge of this forest, remember, the quietest place inside it is not the safest. And if the wind around you seems to whisper in human voices, don't turn around. That is not the wind. Don't bring anything that measures time. Here, such things work against you. And don't look back. There are things a person remembers, not with their mind. They remember them with their body, with smell, with a cold that still crawls up the spine whenever darkness falls too fast outside the window. Tomislav remembered that night exactly this way, not as a memory, but as a wound that never fully healed. It happened in the summer of 1995. Tomislav was 15 years old. His older brother Marko was 19. And that night, in a bunker deep inside the forest the locals called the Abyss Zone, Marko stepped out into the darkness and never came back. The bunker was small. 4 concrete walls, a low ceiling that smelled of mold and machine oil. In the corner stood an old iron stove. They found splinters, found matches, and the fire caught on the 3rd try. Alex, who had never been afraid of anything in his life, sat by that fire and stared at the door. Dan had pressed his back against it, as if his weight alone was enough to hold back whatever was on the other side. And Tomislav sat next to his brother against the wall and listened. Out there, beyond the door, something hummed. It wasn't like wind. Wind has a rhythm, has pauses. What was outside hummed steadily and without break, like a generator, like a transformer, like something enormous and alive, and completely indifferent to the fact that 4 teenagers had hidden from it inside a concrete box. From time to time, light seeped through the crack between the door and the frame. Not from a flashlight, not moonlight. Gray and dead, like the glow of a television set in an empty room. And in that light, you could make out shadows on the ground. They stood right at the door, but they didn't come in. The fire in the stove held them back. They were afraid of light, even light this weak, even light this dying. That was the only thing stopping them. They were simply waiting for it to go out. The wood in the stove was almost gone. That was the real problem. Not the creatures beyond the door, not the hum that seemed to seep through the walls. The real problem was the wood. When the fire died, the darkness would come in, along with everything that lived inside it. Tomislav read his brother in an instant. It wasn't intuition, he simply knew him to the bone. The way Marko held his shoulders made it clear. A decision had been made, and nothing about that was good. Later, as an adult, Tomislav understood something. Marko had grasped what the others hadn't. The creatures outside weren't drawn just to the warmth of the fire. They were drawn to the warmth of the living, to the energy a human radiates through breath, through fear, through a beating heart. And Marko was like a beacon in the fog, the brightest, the most alive, the most visible to them. If he left, they would follow him, not because he was a hero, but because they could see him more clearly than all the rest. Marco spoke quietly, so as not to wake Alex, who had dozed off by the stove. "I have to go out. They're drawn to living light, and I'm the brightest one to them. If I stay, the fire will die, and they'll come in. You'll wait for dawn, and lead Dan and Alex out along the path to the road. In daylight, the shadows are powerless." "No," said Tomislav. "I won't let you. You promised you'd never leave me. We had a deal." "I'm not leaving you," Marco answered, calm and steady. "I'm keeping my word." "That's not the same thing." Dan tried to hold him back. Marco gently moved his hand aside. He slid the bolt open. He turned to Tomislav one last time and smiled. Not a frightening smile, not a farewell smile, just the smile of an older brother who knows something his younger brother doesn't yet understand. He walked out. The door slammed shut. Outside came the sound of running footsteps, fast and fading. The hum shifted, rising sharper, higher, and began to move away after Marco. The shadows at the door stirred and slipped into the dark. Then Marco's voice, already distant. "Wait for dawn. Don't open the door." And then nothing. Tomislav repeated his brother's name like a mantra. Dan gripped his shoulders. Alex woke up and stared at the door with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The fire in the stove faded and faded and faded. It became red embers. Then the embers went dark too. And they sat in the blackness, inside a concrete box in the middle of a forest the locals called the Abyss Zone, and they waited for dawn. To understand what happened that night, you need to go back a little, to the river, to a wooden pier, to an ordinary summer morning that seemed, at the time, like just a morning. The town of Kutov sits at the edge of a large pine forest. On a map, the forest looks like just a forest, a green patch, nothing remarkable. But if you pull out old maps, the ones drawn in the 1950s, you notice something strange. On maps from 1953, this forest carries a marking, the Abyss Zone. On maps from 1955, that marking is gone. The forest is still there, but the label is not, as if someone decided it was better that way. The people of Kutov knew about this forest. They knew you didn't go there. They knew that those who went anyway didn't all come back. And those who did come back said strange things, that time moved differently there, that clocks lied, that you could enter the forest at noon and step out at night, and only 3 hours would have passed. That day, 4 of them sat by the river. Tomislav, 15 years old, thin and quiet. Marco, broad-shouldered and sure of himself. Dan, neat and precise, always with a notebook. And Alex, loud and funny, always with his cap tilted sideways. "My great-grandfather worked with a geological survey team in the 50s, said Dan, not lifting his eyes from his notebook. They found something in that forest that made the expedition's leadership order all the maps confiscated and all the reports classified. One of the geologists came back a completely different person and couldn't sleep properly for the rest of his life. The town archives have records of disappearances, and every single one happened in the same location." Tomislav was silent. He was thinking about Marco leaving. Their father had left too. He said he would never abandon them. And then he simply didn't come home. Tomislav had made a promise to himself, never to trust promises again. But he trusted Marco, only Marco. "Let's go into the forest," Marco said. And before he got up from the pier, Marco leaned close to Tomislav and spoke quietly. "I know you are scared about me leaving, but I will never abandon you. Even if I go, I am still right here, always. That is a promise." "Dad said the same thing," answered Tomislav, not looking up. Marco didn't soften. He said it firmly, without hesitation. "I am not Dad. I am your brother, and I keep my word." At first, everything was normal. A forest like any other. A path. Dense firs. Patches of sunlight on the ground. Dan walked ahead with a compass and a map. Alex made scary sounds with his mouth and laughed. Tomislav stayed close to Marco. The path into the forest was a single narrow one, nearly hidden in the grass, not marked on any modern map. The people of Kutov knew it existed, but didn't walk it. Dan knew it from his great-grandfather's descriptions, and that was exactly why he led the way. He had been preparing for this for years. The first strange thing was a toy. Hanging from the branch of an old fir tree was a stuffed bear. Old and worn, with one eye, a dark button, the other one torn out. The fur had matted down, the limbs splayed out like a scarecrow. Tomislav said nothing. He looked at the single eye, that dark button, and had the feeling the toy was looking back. Then they found a rusted miner's jacket on a branch. Nearby, next to an overgrown well choked with nettles, small bones lay arranged on the ground in a neat circle. Bird or cat, hard to tell, but arranged deliberately. The bones looked fresh, untouched by rain or animals, as if someone renewed this circle regularly. It was here that Tomislav first checked his watch. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, several hours until sunset. Everything was fine. But then they reached the clearing. In the clearing was an old cemetery, dozens of leaning crosses, headstones covered in moss. Some still had legible dates: 1953, 1959, 1966, 1978. Alex walked among the stones, reading them aloud. And then he stopped. On one stone, set slightly apart from the others, was a date, 1995. This year, the current year. The stone looked new. No moss, no streaks, as if it had been placed recently. But there was no name, only a date. Someone was already buried here this year. Or someone knew in advance who would be. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone with a carved symbol, a circle crossed by a straight line. That symbol belonged to no religion any of them knew. It was simply there, old and deliberate, like a warning. And then Alex said something that made them all go cold inside. "The sun is setting, but we only got here an hour ago." Tomislav looked at his watch. The digits jumped. First 1548, then 0000, then 2359. The screen went dark. Dan pulled out his mechanical watch. He looked at the dial and then up at the others. The second hand was running backwards. The sky darkened at an impossible speed, as if someone were dragging a vast black curtain across the whole horizon. In 2 minutes, it was completely dark. The moon rose, enormous, blood red, wrong in shape. That wasn't a moon you should ever see. And then figures appeared at the edge of the clearing. They stood between the trees, gray, burned, as if someone had set them on fire long ago and they had simply remained, charred silhouettes with hollow eye sockets. They were drawn to living warmth, but they didn't step into the clearing. The flashlights held them back. They were waiting for the batteries to die. "Run," Marco commanded, and they ran, all 4 of them, through the dark forest, over roots and gullies, never switching off their flashlights for even a second. The figures didn't run after them. They simply appeared, here and there, between the trees, motionless, waiting, as if they knew that sooner or later the light would run out. Dan found the door, steel, set into an earthen slope in a ravine, almost hidden under roots and moss. They pulled. It opened. They went in. They threw the bolt. The bunker had been built in the 40s. Massive concrete walls, narrow ventilation slots near the ceiling, hooks for hanging lamps. At some point, this place had sheltered people or stored something important. Then it had been forgotten, or someone had pretended to forget. The walls were covered in graffiti, names and dates, in different languages, as if people had sought shelter here across decades. And everywhere, in every language, the same words repeated: "Do not open until dawn." On one wall, in paint, faded but readable: "We came in here in 1979. We opened the door after 3 days. If you want to live, do not go out before dawn." Alex found a box of wood chips and matches, got the stove going, and the fire immediately changed everything. In its light, the bunker stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like a refuge. Outside, the hum continued. The shadows scratched at the door, but they didn't come in. The light held them back. On the wall across from the stove hung an old mirror in a wooden frame, cracked and blackened with age. In places like this, mirrors are sometimes hung deliberately. There is a belief that they hold darkness to their side, hold it, or attract it. That depends on which side you're standing. Marco walked over to the mirror to look at himself, to make sure he was all right. Tomislav stood behind him. At first, everything was normal. But then Marco's reflection began to change. Not the face, something deeper. The reflection looked out from the mirror with an expression the living Marco didn't have. And then the reflection simply vanished. And behind the place where the reflection should have been, deep in the mirror, where by any logic there should have been the bunker wall, there was no wall. There was space, dark, reaching somewhere inward. And in that space stood gray silhouettes. "What's in there?" Tomislav asked. Marco turned away from the mirror sharply, as if he had torn his gaze away by force. Nothing, just dust. He wasn't telling the truth. Tomislav felt it, but he didn't ask again. The night stretched on. Alex dozed off by the stove. Dan pressed his back against the door. The firewood was burning down, and when only one chip remained, Marco stood up and walked out. When gray dawn light appeared in the cracks, Tomislav slid the bolt open himself. Dan tried to stop him. "Wait, we need to be sure." Tomislav didn't wait. He opened the door. Outside was the most ordinary morning. Sun above the trees, birds. A forest like any forest. No gray figures. In daylight they had vanished, as if they had never existed. The three of them stood in the ravine by an old oak, and everything around them was quiet and normal. Tomislav ran back along the path. He called his brother's name. The forest was silent. By the time they reached the road, Tomislav glanced at his hands and stopped. There was dirt under his nails, as if he had been digging. His palms were raw. His legs barely held him. They had thought they spent one night in the bunker, but their bodies knew something different. Time in that bunker hadn't just moved differently, it had drawn something out of them. At the road stood two cars. From the first, their mother leaped out, red-eyed, in the same clothes she had apparently worn for all 3 days. Their mother rushed to Tomislav. She grabbed his shoulders. She looked at his face. Alive. Whole. Here. Then she looked around. Her voice trembled. "Where is Marco?" Tomislav checked the time. The watch was running again. It showed 11 in the morning. They had entered the forest 3 days ago, around 8. For them, only one night had passed. For everyone else, 3 days. "Marco didn't come back," Tomislav said quietly. They searched for him for 2 more weeks. Police, rescue teams, volunteers. They combed the entire forest. They found nothing. No trace, no clothing, no compass. The case was closed as a disappearance. In the district archive, a folder appeared with a photograph of 4 teenagers. On the back, a simple note. Missing, Marco Hayas, age 19. Found, Tomislav Hayas, age 15. Daniel, age 15. Alexander, age 15. Tomislav left Kutov a year later. He couldn't stay in a place where every street reminded him of his brother. Alex held on longer, but 2 years later he packed his things too. Said the trees kept appearing in his dreams. Dan stayed. He always knew his place was here, among these papers, these folders marked Abyss Zone. They never talked about that night. There simply were no words. 30 years passed. Tomislav lived in another city. He worked. He thought about his brother sometimes, especially when memories came crashing in at night, when the dark fell faster than it should. In those 30 years, he never once went back to Kutov. But one day, Dan called. A letter turned up, Dan said over the phone, written in Marco's hand, with fresh ink, inside a sealed folder, inside a locked safe, in a place it could not possibly be. He hesitated, then added one word, "Come." Kutov had barely changed. The same streets, the same provincial quiet, the same cafe at the crossroads with its faded sign. In a shop window hung an old photograph, miners at the entrance to a shaft, black and white, dated 1952. All of them held tools or stood with their hands at their sides, except for one man at the far right. He was pointing somewhere, to the side, toward the forest. Dan was waiting in the cafe. He was older now, with tired eyes, dressed in the uniform of the sheriff. But his gaze, it was the same as when they were children. They drank their coffee almost in silence, just sitting with the weight of being together again. Finally, Dan leaned forward and spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something I need to show you, but not here." In the basement of the police station was a room with a combination lock. A sign on the door read, "Restricted Access." Dan opened the lock and went in first. Tomislav followed. Inside stood iron cabinets, shelves of folders, and rows of filing drawers. The room smelled of old paper and something else. It was the particular heavy scent of places where things are kept that have no reasonable explanation. Dan took out a folder. On the cover, it read, "Abyss Zone, Incident 1995, Access Level 4. Inside were statements, maps, and photographs, and letters. Letters like these appear in the archive from time to time. They don't arrive by mail. They don't arrive by hand. One morning, they are simply inside sealed folders, in locked cabinets, in places where they absolutely weren't the night before. Foresters, hunters, people passing through. Sometimes they find them at the edge of the trees. No envelopes, no stamps, just sheets of paper. Dan gestured to the surrounding cabinets. But most often, they appear right here, in the archive, on their own. "How is that possible?" Tomislav asked. Dan looked at the rows of iron drawers. The forest cannot send a letter to someone's home, but it can place one where memory is kept, in the archive. The letters look fresh because time doesn't dry out there. The ink doesn't fade, even over decades. It is part of the anomaly. Does anyone else know about this? Dan was quiet for a long moment. I tried to find out where the copies go. I hit a dead wall. Someone up the chain is watching this forest, and they don't like questions. Tomislav looked at the stacks of paper. There were several dozen such letters. Different handwriting, different names. People who had vanished into this forest over 70 years. All of them wrote more or less the same thing. Don't look for me. I'm here. It's different here. Time moves differently here. And every single letter looked as if it had been written yesterday. Then Dan walked to the safe in the corner. He entered the code. He opened it. Inside, on top of old documents from 1995, lay a single sheet, crisp and clean. The ink still gleamed. This folder was sealed in '98, Dan whispered. 3 days ago, I broke the seal. The letter was not there. He looked at Tomislav, his expression unreadable. In the morning, the letter was inside. Tomislav picked up the sheet. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, but the ink was blue and bright, as if written just moments ago. He ran his finger along the lines. The ink smeared. It had not dried. After 30 years, the ink had not dried. Marco had written, "If you are reading these lines, the forest has not let me go. Don't look for me, it's pointless. But I want you to know, I kept my word. I never abandoned you, and I am still here. Come when you are ready. Only, don't bring a watch. I am no longer quite human. I have become part of this place, not alive and not dead. Something third, something your language doesn't even have a name for. I cannot leave, though nothing holds me by force. The forest took what it took. Not everything, but enough that I cannot return." In the lower right corner was a date, July 15th, 1995. That same day, the day Marco had walked out of the bunker. Dan held out a compass, old, in a metal casing, the glass cracked. This is Marco's compass, found in the bunker in '98. It works, sometimes. Tomislav took the compass. The needle jerked and went still. It pointed northwest, toward the forest. "I have to go," Tomislav said. Dan nodded slowly. "I knew," he answered, "you'd say that." Tomislav entered the forest alone, without a watch, with Marco's compass and an old map Dan had drawn back in '95 and kept all these years. The forest had grown denser over 30 years. The path had nearly disappeared under the overgrowth, but the landmarks remained. There was the old well, choked with nettles. There were the bones at its base, still in the same circle, fresh, untouched by rain or animals, just as they had been 30 years before. The rusted jacket on the branch was completely decayed now, held up only by wire. And the bear, still on the same branch, 30 years, and it hung there in the same place. One eye, a button, the other torn out. The fur had turned to dust, but it was there, as if it had been waiting. Tomislav walked and thought about what he was doing. He knew that this was, perhaps, madness, but he understood that he could no longer live with the question of what if. If Marco was truly there, he had to find that out for himself. The compass led steadily. The needle held to the northwest, unwavering, as if someone on the other end was holding it in place. He found the bunker. The door was ajar, not broken open, simply open, as if he were expected. Inside, everything was just as it had been. The same stove, the same chairs, the same mirror in its cracked frame. Only cobwebs everywhere, and a thick layer of dust. Tomislav walked to the mirror and looked at himself. Gray at the temples, lines around his eyes. The reflection looked back and didn't lag. An ordinary mirror, an ordinary reflection. On a cot in the corner lay a backpack. Old, canvas, with metal clasps. Tomislav recognized it at once. This was the backpack Marco had carried that day. He opened it. Inside was a diary, Marco's handwriting. The first entries were dated July 1995. The last ones, 2023. 28 years of entries. Tomislav leafed through and read in fragments. Marco wrote about the forest, about how time moved here, not in a line, but in circles. About the creatures, neither evil nor good, just part of this place. About seeing people outside sometimes, hunters, hikers, and giving them a sign to leave alive. And about Tomislav, much about Tomislav, in almost every entry. The last entry had no date, a single sentence. Today he is here. I can feel it. Forgive me, Tommy. Tomislav closed the diary. He stepped out of the bunker. Marco stood in a clearing. Not the cemetery clearing, just a clearing. Sunny, with tall grass. An ordinary place. But in the middle of that ordinary place stood a half-translucent figure. Marco, 19 years old. He looked exactly as he had the day he walked out of the bunker. Young, broad-shouldered, in the same jacket. Only the jacket was badly worn and faded. Time here had not touched his face. The forest had frozen him in that exact moment. 19 years old, that night, that choice. They looked at each other. Tomislav didn't move. Neither did Marco. Then, Marco smiled, a ghost of the expression he had worn 3 decades ago. Hello, brother. I waited. I always knew you would come. Are you alive? Tomislav asked, his voice catching. Marco looked at his hands, turning them over slowly, as if inspecting a curious object. I don't know, he replied softly, but I'm here. I kept my word. I didn't abandon you. Tomislav stepped forward and held out his hand. Marco reached out his own. The palm was ice cold, almost translucent. Through the skin, Tomislav thought he could see the vibrant green of the grass beneath. He flinched, a shiver running down his spine, but he didn't let go. Come with me, Tomislav said, his voice firming with a sudden, desperate resolve. Just come, together. Marco shook his head. No, I can't. I'm part of this place now. He was silent for a moment, the golden light of the clearing seeming to flicker around his edges. Then he looked at his brother with a weight of sorrow that felt far older than 19 years. But you have to leave, and never come back. Never. Then Marco reached into the pocket of his jacket. His hand emerged, holding a small stuffed bear. It was whole, not decayed, whole, almost like new. Both eyes were in place, one a simple button, the other embroidered in a cross-stitch, neat and careful, just as it had been the day they had played as children. Tomislav looked at it and understood everything. For 30 years that bear had hung on the branch, rotting, losing its fur, losing its second eye. And here, in a place where time moved differently, Marco had found it, had repaired it. He'd had the time, 30 years of time, and he had spent some of that time giving the bear back its second eye. "Take it," Marco said. "It's proof that none of it was for nothing, that I kept my word." Tomislav took the bear. Its fabric felt strangely solid against his palm, a stark contrast to the ethereal cold of his brother's hand. He looked up at him, at that 19-year-old face that carried the weight of a lifetime of solitude in his tired eyes. "I love you, brother," Tomislav whispered, his voice trembling in the quiet of the clearing. "And I love you," Marco answered, his form beginning to blur and merge with the shifting light of the trees. Always. Marco was quiet for a second. Then he added, his voice barely a breath against the wind, "Go. Don't look back." Tomislav turned and walked. Behind him, he heard silence. Then the soft, rhythmic rustle of grass, as if someone were walking alongside him, or perhaps just the wind passing through the clearing. Then nothing. He walked along the path toward the road, clutching the stuffed bear in his hand. The weight of it was grounding, a piece of a life that had been suspended in time. He kept his stride steady, his gaze fixed on the edge of the trees, and he did not look back. Not once. A couple of days later, in the cafe at the crossroads, Dan sat at the same table by the window. When Tomislav came in, Dan looked at his hands and said nothing. He simply nodded. Tomislav placed the bear and the compass on the table. He sat down across from him. "He's alive," Tomislav said, his voice low and heavy. He paused, looking Dan in the eyes. "I saw him." "I know," Dan answered. "It happens. Every few years, someone sees their person, the ones the forest took. Nobody believes it, but it happens." Tomislav gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "What do I do now?" Dan shrugged, a slow, weary movement that seemed to settle the matter once and for all. "Live," he said quietly, "the way he wanted you to." Tomislav put the bear into his bag. He stood up. At the door, he stopped and looked out the window. Beyond the houses, beyond the rooftops, beyond the tree line on the horizon, the dark wall of the forest was visible, dense and impenetrable, the same as 30 years ago. He turned away and walked out. Marco's compass stayed on the little table. The needle stood still for a long moment. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to rotate. Not fast, just in circles, again and again. Dan watched it. The waitress brought coffee. Outside, the sun was shining. Everything was fine. The needle kept turning. Sometimes, when the wind blows from the northwest through Kutov, the residents hear something. It is hard to describe. Not quite a sound, not quite a word, something in between. As if someone is saying a name, but very quietly, almost below the threshold of hearing. Some say it's just the wind moving through the treetops. They are probably right. Probably not.